if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance.
Hello, and it's a pleasure to be here to deliver this George C. Marshall Legacy Lecture. I'm going to be talking today about the legacy of the Second World War experience in the memory of contemporary China. And in that sense, it's a talk that combines both a very painful episode in Chinese history, along with much of the issue which perhaps consumes the contemporary US-China relationship more than any other, the question of whether the two countries are going to come into conflict, whether it's a Cold War or something even more frightening. And I think to understand the dynamics and the complexities and the turbulence behind these very important questions, knowing the historical background and the current legacy of the Second World War experience in China is a very useful tool in our kit of understanding. So to do that, let me start, if I may, with a few images that I think are going to take us on the trajectory that I'd like us to go on today. So let me start with this image, if I may, and some of you who are perhaps people who keep up with dramas and representations of the Second World War might remember from just over 10 years ago, the HBO TV series, The Pacific, which was produced by, of course, the Hollywood power team of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, and told the tale of a group of Marines who fought their way through elements of the Pacific War of the Second World War period. So that became something that I think is quite well known in the Western world, certainly in the United States. Perhaps less familiar is this production, Dongfeng Yu, East Wind Rain, coincidentally released in the same year, the year 2010, was a major blockbuster movie. It tells a story of an exciting but perhaps underknown moment in the Second World War experience, just before Pearl Harbor, late 1941, when a secret intelligence discovery by Chinese communist agents is smuggled through various routes up to President Roosevelt, in fact, but sadly, he doesn't pay any attention to it. And as a result, Pearl Harbor happens, the attack happens on American naval ships, with the result that we, of course, all know. It's a very lively and well put together story. The only problem, of course, as historians will know, is it's not based on anything in actual fact. It's a fictional construction about this secret intelligence, but it is the basis of a film which was quite a big hit in China at the time. Why do I bring up these two productions, one for the small screen in the US, one for the big screen in China, at the same time? And the reason comes from a blogger, or a pair of bloggers, I should say, who are quite well known in China, or one of them is anyway, and who wrote on a comparison between these two drama productions in that same year. So Sima Pingbang, which is the nom d'écran or screen name of one of these two bloggers, co-wrote an essay comparing and contrasting these two productions in the public mind back in 2010. And he looked at the heroic narratives in both, in the case of the American Hollywood production, the HBO production, The Pacific, a very patriotic story, of course, about how the United States spilt blood and spent treasure to regain East Asia from the Japanese Empire. And in the case of East Wind Rain, there, a Chinese patriotism about trying to provide undercover intelligence that might do something to defeat the Japanese from their point of view as well. And the comparisons between these two productions are not lost on our Chinese blogger, who observed, amongst other things, that in some ways, although the narratives of both productions are essentially about a heroic story defeating the Japanese, they're really also about the the continuing competition, both then and now, between the United States and China. In other words, in the case of the Chinese production Dongfengyu, there is an implication that had the Chinese got on with the Americans, had the Americans got on better with the Chinese back then, and indeed by analogy today, the world would be a much smoother place. And from the point of view of the Pacific, the Tom Hanks Spielberg production, the Chinese don't really figure in it at all, but it's a wider reminder that one of the reasons that even today, the United States has such a powerful diplomatic and security role in the East Asian sphere is very much because it fought and won those battles all the way back 3/4 of a century before. So in the minds of at least these, I think, rather sharp, thoughtful Chinese bloggers, the idea of comparing the American HBO series and the Chinese movie was in some ways a very powerful one in terms of looking at both the competition between the US and China and an understanding of my key topic today, which is the legacy, the continuing legacy of World War II and that experience in the minds of China's policymakers and also wider cultural figures and general population as well, the middle class population in particular in China today. For all of them, World War II is still in many ways a highly influential, very important piece of the past that has a great deal of influence in the present. So let me go on and say a little bit in detail about why I want to make that claim. Now, to do that, we have to start, first of all, with just a little bit of background on World War II in China itself. And it's worth noting that World War II in China is perhaps the single most important theater of that well-known conflict, which is least known. Everyone, certainly in the Western world, knows something about World War II. Many people know far less about the experience of the Chinese during that conflict. And so it's worth remembering some of the key and in some ways very staggering, horrifying statistics that accompany that experience. We can't give even now exact figures, but certainly credible estimates suggest 8 to 40 million deaths caused by the war, not just combat casualties, those are there, of course, but also civilian deaths through bombing, like the bombing of the city of Chongqing, which you see on the right-hand side of the image there, the temporary wartime capital in southwest China, repeatedly bombed over many years during that period, and also deaths from famine, starvation, bacteriological warfare, whole variety of other horrific events during those 8 wartime years. Worth noting, of course, that the war breaks out for China, between China and Japan, 2 years earlier than in Europe, and 4.5 years before the American entry at Pearl Harbor. It was also a war for China of refugees. Once the Japanese had invaded in 1937, much of China's most prosperous, most developed areas found themselves essentially invaded and occupied. And for millions of people, the only answer was to flee in front of the advancing troops, who then, advancing Japanese troops, with many civilians and indeed military and government figures, then making their way to the interior of China for the duration of the war. That condition essentially demanded that China's nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, the then Chinese leader, and their uneasy ally, the Chinese Communist Party, worked together to try and hold China in stasis, you might say, until the final entry of the Western allies, the United States and the British Empire, after Pearl Harbor in 1941. But even then, China continued to suffer, and by the end of the war, most of its infrastructure, aside from the millions of deaths, but most of its infrastructure, the bridges, the roads, the railways, which had been painstakingly created, often under very difficult conditions in the pre-war years, were mostly smashed into small pieces and essentially had to be rebuilt from scratch. So make no mistake, World War II for China was a traumatic, terrifying, and a turbulent experience. And beyond that, we should add that even if it tends to be in the shadows of the historiography that most Westerners have about World War II, it's worth remembering that if China had surrendered a year in 1938, as indeed many people thought it would do at the time, then the whole history, not just of the war in Asia, but the global war would be different. Because if China had surrendered, it seems much less easy to imagine that an event like Pearl Harbor would have happened. And if that had been the case, then the United States getting into the Asian and European wars would have been a much more difficult proposition. So World War II in China, a transformative set of events. Worth noting that at that time, China was led, as it was for a quarter of a century on China's mainland, by this figure here, Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi in the Mandarin pronunciation, but known generally in the West by an alternative romanization of Chiang Kai-shek. China's generalissimo, the head of the Chinese nationalist or Kuomintang party, and a figure of global significance for nearly half a century, even though the second half of his political life was spent in exile on the island of Taiwan after he lost the Chinese Civil War against the communists. But against the Japanese, this in some ways often rather dour-seeming figure nonetheless was the figure who symbolized resistance to Japan on behalf of the Chinese people, along, as I mentioned, with his communist allies, to be fair. And as part of that mixture, we also see that China found itself not just fighting for its life and desperately looking and in the end managing to find allies who were able to bring it ultimately to victory, the British and the Americans, but also to take a place with the particular sponsorship of President Roosevelt into the new world order that would emerge after 1945, and indeed which to this very day we still think of as the post-1945 world order, even though, of course, in many ways that order is tattered, fraying, crumbling, and in a desperately difficult state from the point of view of many looking at it today. But it's still visible in the form that came into being in 1945. And one of the elements, which again is often forgotten, that here at the initiation of the United Nations, one of the most important products of that reworking of world order was the presence of China. Nationalist China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who I've mentioned here, just to have him again. He was not at San Francisco personally. He sent Sun Tzu-wen, his prime minister, and there was a delegation of Chinese there, including one communist delegate as well, all of whom became, as the Chinese even today will tell you, not just signatories, but the first signatory to the United Nations Charter in 1945 in San Francisco. And this marked the beginning of the globalization of China, which went in fits and starts through many kind of twisted elements of from here to there, largely because, of course, the eventual victory of the communists and the People's Republic of China in 1949 meant that China was excluded from the global order for the best part of 30 years. Despite all of that, it is worth remembering that China was indeed made one of the signatory members of the first United Nations, and also, of course, then, as now, one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So at least when it comes to international governance, it's worth saying that China's wartime experience during World War II was a sort of bitter victory. And you could say that because the destruction that I mentioned, the millions of deaths, the destruction of the infrastructure, all of that was real and, almost irreparable, certainly in the short term. But in terms of international standing, China's presence as one of the allies and its continued resistance to Japan over 8 years gave it the right to be considered a core maker of the new international order. So reminder there, as I hope I have done in the last few minutes, of just why it is that China can, in its own eyes, and also perhaps more broadly, globally, be seen as having taken big steps into the new world order in the mid-1940s, around the years of World War II, and then in the immediate aftermath of that horrible conflict as well. However, it is also worth noting that the story that I've just told you, which for many of the other members of the UN Security Council, the United States, the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, for those countries, the story was one of continued consolidation of their own nation states and continued deepening of their presence in international society, even during the middle of an emerging Cold War. That was essentially the story for the Soviets, for the Americans, and the other Cold War states. But China very quickly became different for a reason that I think is well known, but worth remembering. In 1945, the China that signed that United Nations Charter was ruled by the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, who I just showed you a little earlier. But between 1946 and 1949, China was convulsed by a horrific civil war. The two uneasy resistance forces, the Chinese nationalists or Kuomintang and the Chinese communists, the first under Chiang Kai-shek, the second under Mao Zedong, fought with each other to the death in one of the world's most vicious civil wars. Now, it's worth noting that attempts were made, valiant attempts to try and settle the civil war, and one of the most impressive, over a year, was undertaken by no less a figure than George C. Marshall, whose legacy, of course, these lectures are named in. Now, Marshall did more than perhaps any other foreigner could have done, and his immense standing in the world by 1946 was one of the reasons why both sides were willing to accept his mediation. But even for him, it proved impossible to reconcile two groups, Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists, who had very different visions of what the nation should be. One looking for internationalization, pro-Americanism, and essentially quite slow social evolution towards a more equal society. On the Chinese side, the Chinese communist side, radical revolution, immense violence in terms of how society would be transformed in that revolution, but also a lean to the other side towards the Soviet Union. And we all know how that story ends, I'm sure, but just a reminder, 1949, the communists defeated the nationalists. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, never to return to the mainland. And in the center of Beijing, Chairman Mao Zedong, declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Now, the Cold War years that followed, the 1950s to the 1980s, were notable in many ways, but one way that often is not given as much attention as it might be is the rather strange Chinese communist attitude towards the Second World War. And that's essentially because that Second World War only appeared in very partial and often very formalized ways in public culture. So unlike Britain or Russia, Soviet Union, countries where the victory in the Second World War was treated as a sort of absolutely central part of national culture, it was certainly discussed in Mao's China, but because class struggle, the struggle of different groups against each other, culminating ultimately in the disastrous cultural revolution of the 1960s, because that sort of ideology became much more important in terms of the way in which the People's Republic of China under Mao thought about itself, the story of World War II was reduced to a very minimal, very flat version of the original. The version that you would hear essentially in China was in some ways written by a gentleman like the one I'm showing you here. This was Hu Jiamu. Hu Jiamu was one of the strongest and most rigid ideologues of the Chinese Communist Party. During the 1930s, 1940s, he had been very close to Mao Zedong, the major communist leader. Hu Jiamu was a theoretician of communism, but he was also a historian. And he wrote some of the best known and most influential surveys of history written in China during the early years of the People's Republic. And amongst other things, they helped to frame the way in which the People's Republic thought about its 8 years of fighting against the Japanese. And in that version, lots of things were missing. There was no mention in any favorable way of the immense sacrifices made by the nationalist government and their armies, who had lost millions and millions of troops as part of the fighting. Nor was there any, nor was there any mention of the central role of the United States in essentially funding China during the second half of the war. The reason being that, of course, after 1949, the United States and China were essentially at loggerheads. They were enemies with each other, and they found themselves on opposite sides of a Cold War divide. So it became impossible from Mao's point of view to spend any time giving credit to the Americans for having helped China actually win the war. So all of those elements meant that the story of World War II that was told for more than 30 years in the mainland of China was a story that only said that the fight against the Japanese was essentially led by the Chinese Communist Party itself, that they were in the leading role, that essentially nobody else had any very important role in that particular victory, and that therefore historians should look at the role of the communists and no other actors during that particular period. That began to change in the mainland of China under the communist system, but nonetheless it began to change in the 1980s. Why? Well, first of all, it's worth noting what the changes were, and very broadly, the old Chinese Kuomintang, the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek's party, the former rulers of China, and the defeated enemy in the Civil War, well, these people started to reappear in China's national story of the war, told from Beijing. And what's more, they reappeared actually in some ways rather favorable terms, in which, okay, they were not given the same standing as the communists, but there was an official line that actually they had done quite a lot of recognizable and decent good in terms of helping to defeat the Japanese eventually. And one of the ways in which we can tell how this story was shifting was the role of Hu Jiamu, who, as I mentioned, started off as a historian, as a theoretician, as a very dedicated communist who marched through all sorts of desperately poor and dangerous areas of China during the 30s and 40s to stick with the communist revolution. By the 1980s, he was a much older man, much more senior man, very involved with the propaganda enterprise in China itself. And as part of that, he started writing major editorial pieces in the Chinese Communist Party's house newspaper, including known as the People's Daily, which includes always clues as to what the top leadership is thinking. And in this, he started to he wrote one editorial piece that made a lot of very sharp points and very directed points about the way that the Chinese people should start thinking about their World War II experience. And one of the ways in which Hu Jiamu talked about that was essentially to say that China should think about not just the communist revolution, 1949, but actually the end of World War II, 1945, as also a turning point in China's own history. Now, he wasn't in any way downplaying the communist revolution. That wouldn't have been very likely, considering he used to be Chairman Mao's right-hand man. But that having been said, he also wanted to try and stress the idea that China's victory in World War II, even though it had been a victory which the nationalists had a great deal to deal with, the Kuomintang had a great deal to do with it, despite all of that, it was still important for China to re-embrace that sense of having fought the war, and also thereby claim some sort of ownership of the legacy of that war in later years. What kind of legacy would that be? Let me try and give some examples of what I mean by that term. Because Hu Jiamu, as I say, was a big figure all the way into the 1980s. He died in the early 1990s, 1992, I think. But the idea that he exemplified in some ways, that China needed to start thinking in a broader way about the international as well as the domestic implications of its World War II experiences, that is something that was very much part of his view of what the Communist Party should actually say and embrace. So that was a departure from the past, a more broad-looking, a more wide-ranging interpretation of the meaning of World War II for the wider Chinese people. So what effects does this have? Let's have a look. Well, first of all, it has changed the way, and I'm changing to the present tense now, or the present perfect, because actually these are things that began to emerge in the 1970s and 1980s, but more than half a century later are still going strong in all sorts of ways. And I've written a recent book, China's Good War, which talks very much more about this phenomenon if you're interested in it. But let's give a couple of examples here. So on screen, you may well have recognized the shot there from the Cairo conference, the diplomatic conference held in November 1943, one of the summit conferences of the Second World War period. And I'm sure you'll recognize many of the figures in this picture. President Roosevelt in the middle there, next to him in this rather fetching white safari suit, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And on either side, two important Chinese figures, Chiang Kai-shek, the Generalissimo, ruler of China on the left-hand side as we see it, and on the other side, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Sung Meiling, who was, of course, Chiang Kai-shek's wife, but also a fluent speaker of English, and in a way, a sort of elite interpreter of China to the outside world, particularly to the United States. Madame Chiang Kai-shek, as she was often known, Sung Mei-ling, was one of the few figures, even to date, to have addressed both houses of Congress, and in general was seen as a sort of modernizing force, able to represent her husband to the outside world since he didn't speak English. So that's the Cairo Conference, and for us history buffs, an interesting event. But why should that have any relevance whatsoever to the way that China thinks about itself in the present day world? Well, that comes from a different part of the events that we've talked about here. So here you have a picture of the formal photo around the time of the diplomatic discussions of what was going to be done in terms of the defense of Asia. Okay, but off the back of that, we also have to remember that at the end of the conference, in the end of November of 1943, you have a communique, a short statement put out by the principal figures in this at this conference, in all of their names, Chiang Kai-shek, Roosevelt, Churchill, declaring that when Japan had been defeated, and at that point they knew that Japan would be defeated, it was just a question of how long it would take to do it. So the statement said, the communique said, when China has been defeated, okay, then at that point we are going to demand that all islands other than the Japanese home islands are given back to their original rightful owners, which might include the Republic of China, the country that Chiang Kai-shek was ruling over. Now, this statement made in 1943 seemed to almost get kind of lost in the crush of so many things that happened afterwards. But in 2013, in other words, 70 years after the signing of the Cairo communique, just 70 years later, it became increasingly evident this Cairo conference was being mentioned over and over again in Chinese state media. Why did China spend so much time talking about this relatively obscure event from World War II? And the answer is that by looking at that statement that the islands were supposed to be given back by Japan to other powers, including the Republic of China, China makes the case that actually a particular set of islands, they're known as Senkaku in Japanese, Jiaoyu in Chinese, they're halfway between China and Japan, they're uninhabited, there's about 8 of them, but they are the subject of huge disputes between the two sides. They are recognized, well, they're taken by Japan and occupied by Japan as its territory, but China makes a claim to them and claims that in fact they're its territory, and they are using the Cairo communique as a means of defining why they think their Chinese claim is right. So the events and the communique of the Cairo Conference of 1943 is just one example of events from the relatively distant World War II past that are now being brought out and used as part of a wider strategy of Chinese self-definition when it comes to territorial claims in the wider world. The movie also helps to promote patriotism, and in 2015, the Cairo Declaration events were turned into a motion picture. Again, you can see here actors playing various of the various figures you saw before, including Winston Churchill there with the bow tie, and also some figures who weren't there. Joseph Stalin, you see there on the left-hand side as well. But there was one thing about this movie poster, which was, as I say, for a movie that was made to instill patriotic feelings in the Chinese people about the need to reclaim those islands under the term of the Cairo Declaration. There was one element about this film, or the poster for the film, which you see here, which caused a certain amount of consternation, a certain amount of amusement on the part of many of China's internet citizens who were watching this. And that's the fact that right in the middle there, you see here you have an actor playing Chairman Mao. And if you look back, as I'll show you, to the conference picture, you'll see that we have Chiang Kai-shek, we have FDR, we have Winston Churchill, we have Madame Chiang Kai-shek. But one thing we sure do not have is Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party, who was at that time, of course, living in caves up in the heart of northwest China in Shanxi province. So what is Chairman Mao doing on there? Well, China's social media, internet netizens, as they're called, the kind of citizens of the net, mocked the film, or mocked the film poster for, as they saw it, trying to be even more holy than the Pope. In other words, trying to sort of be extra communist, even when the Communist Party wasn't necessarily asking them to do so. And the point here was that instead of showing Chiang Kai-shek, who might have been a bit problematic in terms of an appearance on a poster like this, showing Chairman Mao was a way of showing that your patriotic credentials had not been damaged. But the Chinese internet, which is nothing if not sarcastic, found this a very, very foolish way to try and address the problem. And they addressed it themselves by creating their own memes, their own mocking internet versions of this same poster. So take a look at this and then see another set of posters of people who also were not, in fact, in Cairo at that time. And here you have a fine selection. You have Saddam Hussein, you have Kim Jong-un, you have a slightly sleepy-looking Barack Obama, you have Colonel Gaddafi, you have all sorts of people there who essentially were also not there in Cairo in 1943 either, and are being used in this particular case to try and make a point that even China's own internet community doesn't always, react with delight to the way in which propagandists sometimes try and adapt history. So World War II, nonetheless, and the Cairo Declaration is just one example of the kind of wartime events that still have that kind of resonance for China's contemporary issues, such as territorial claims. The war can also be used for other sorts of what you might call feel-good effects. Just over 6 years ago, or about 6 years ago, China's Victory Parade, held on the 3rd of September 2015 in the center of Beijing, in the center of China's capital, Tiananmen Square, was essentially, to date, the only major parade of this sort, the only one to take place in the middle of the symbolic center of Beijing and Tiananmen, the only one which was not specifically a commemoration of some event to do with the Chinese Communist Party. So this year, we've had the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, 1921 to 2021. In previous years, we've had commemorations of the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 and other high-level events to do with the party's history. But here, of course, the Chinese Communist Party were involved, very much so, with World War II, but they were not the political leads at the time. That was Chiang Kai-shek. And they were also people who, and also the victory in World War II itself was part of a wider Allied victory in which China played a role, but not a solo role. So with all those things in mind, using the 70th anniversary of the ending of World War II, 1945 to 2015, was quite a bold move by China to reclaim that legacy of the Second World War. Other examples abound. Again, this one has to do with sort of territory or maritime lines, you might say. I'm sure many of you are aware of the continuing controversies around the South China Sea and China's own claims in that particular area. Well, people often talk about what they call the NineDash Line. In other words, a kind of line drawn on a map that's supposed to show the territory, the boundaries of China's maritime rights. And for those who don't know, just briefly to say, China disputes the way that other states in the region interpret the map of the South China Sea. China claims nearly all of it as being Chinese waters through tradition and other justifications. Other countries in the region, including Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, say, no, we all have an equal share in this particular sea. And between the two, the dispute has carried on in a not yet conflictual, but nonetheless rather alarming sort of a way. So where this idea of a dashed line on the map the Chinese use to this day to justify their claims come from? Well, it has various sources, but one that's been fairly clearly identified is what was then an 11-dash line, it's turned into a 9-dash line in later years, in the maps of the South China Sea in 1947. In other words, as part of that brief moment between the defeat of the Japanese in 1945 and the victory of the Chinese communists in 1949, in those brief 4 years, China's then, as it turned out, dying nationalist government made a great many attempts to try and claim sovereignty over issues of importance to China, of which this presence in the South China Sea is just one. So when you hear people talking about that 11-dash line or the 9-dash line, seeing it also as part of the legacy of those World War II experiences where China fought and sacrificed, and then post-war said that it too should have a share of the spoils that come from breaking up the old empires. All of those are elements of why even today, that particular post-war legacy remains so important. But not all World War II analogies, not all comparisons necessarily meet the favor of today's Chinese leadership. And one example of one that doesn't has to do with the name of the public servant honored by this lecture, George C. Marshall. Now, in the initial phase of China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and again, many of you will know, but just a reminder, a big plan that over the next decade or more, private companies and the state in China will put together loans and donations to try and create an infrastructure belt, which stretches all the way from Southeast Asia through Central Asia to Western Europe and taking in the east coast of Africa as well. And this huge plan, which is supposed to bring in its final form trillions of dollars of investment across the whole region, well, this is being then defined by many in China as one of the most important geopolitical gestures that China has made in decades. So how can they explain it? As you will have probably heard in the news the term Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. It used to be called One Belt, One Road. But even now, actually, to be honest, it's not that easy a term to understand. It has very little resonance, certainly for a Western audience, when using that term Belt and Road Initiative, although it is more familiar now than it might have been a year or two ago. But that wasn't clear in the mid-2010s. So a variety of people, including actually at least two Chinese theoreticians, suggested that China should publicize it as being a new Marshall Plan. Now, from a Western point of view, from our point of view, you can see why that might have seemed very attractive. The Marshall Plan itself is regarded, at least by those of us of a liberal frame of mind, as being a major economic and geopolitical gesture that served essentially to cement democracy in Western Europe. And Marshall's own name still stands, burns very, very bright in the pantheon of Western wartime figures. Not only was the plan still associated very much with him, not only did he have every great prize, including, of course, becoming Secretary of State, but also there is a scholarship scheme named after him. In other words, George C. Marshall is a figure who is greatly respected, and for very good reason, in the Western world. He has, of course, also legacy lectures named after him, and rightly so. This is, of course, not the view of many in China, because the Chinese Communist Party, in many cases, has associated Marshall with that much more difficult period, the year 1946, when Marshall tried valiantly, but in the end unsuccessfully, to negotiate a peace settlement between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists, and was unable to do so and eventually left China at the beginning of 1947, a couple of years before nationalist China fell to the communists. So that all being the case, Marshall and what Mao Zedong actually called the Marshall clique or the Marshall gang doesn't have such a strong reputation in China, certainly not during the Cold War, but even today, it seems a little bit inappropriate in terms of association. And so very quickly, official edicts went out from China that actually many aspects of the post-war were things that China was happy to associate itself with, but not being a new Marshall Plan. And you will very rarely, if ever, see that term used about BRI in the last few years, where it was actually quite commonplace in the first period of the scheme's existence. And that is by way of showing that many aspects of the post-war period are ones that China wishes to recover. But even now, there are some, such as association with George Marshall, which are politically much more turbulent, much more problematic from their point of view. So let me draw some of these threads together, if I may, to make a final point. And I'll refer here, if I may, to the title of my book on the subject, China's Good War. And the reason I use this term, China's Good War, some of you will recognize is that it's a take, an ironic take, on what's already an ironic title, because The Good War, by the great popular historian Studs Terkel, which involved taking oral histories of many of the GIs who had served in the American army during World War II. With their stories in mind, he used the term the Good War almost ironically to contrast the ultimate mission of World War II, not as the war itself being good, but rather its aims and its mission being good in comparison, say, with events like Vietnam. Well, to some extent, World War II has become very big in China, continues to be seen on movie screens and on television, screens and in international diplomacy and in parades through Tiananmen Square and in all these areas, because it too fulfills the purpose of being a good war from the point of view of the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, it's a war where China was attacked through no fault of its own. It then fought back valiantly and with allies ultimately won. And therefore, being seen both to suffer invasion as an innocent victim, but fight back, win and recover, is a narrative, a trajectory, which makes the horrific experience that I mentioned before of the millions of deaths and the huge damage of the war at least worthwhile in terms of China's sense of itself and its mission. And that continues to be the case even today. During the coronavirus pandemic, one of the first metaphors the Chinese Communist Party reached for was the idea that the war against the virus was and is a people's war, a phrase exactly taken from Mao's war against the Japanese back in the 1930s and 40s, now being used by today's China instead to refer to the fight against the spread of the pandemic. So World War II continues to matter for China. World War II is an experience which, of course, affected huge numbers of people, millions of people across the globe, and therefore remains a very powerful legacy force in many of those countries. Certainly the United Kingdom, where I'm speaking to you from today, we still have an awful lot of cultural engagement with World War II, even though it's now more than 75 years since it ended. In America too, in the Smithsonian and elsewhere, you'll see plenty of its legacies. Russia today still celebrates, commemorates the legacy of what it calls the Great Patriotic War. So you shouldn't be surprised, if you are surprised, that China in some ways is in a very similar position. The complexity comes from the fact that many of those who fought China's good war, if they think of it that way, were Chinese nationalists, not Chinese communists. But one of the ironies of history is that to make their narrative work in the present day, China's communists have had to embrace much of the history of the nationalist war effort, even though that's not something they actually say explicitly. And to that extent, I think it's fair to say that China today is one of those societies that has sought comfort in World War II as a means of trying to make sense of the very turbulent sense of social change and geopolitics in the early 21st century where we are today. Thank you all very much for joining me today for this lecture, and it's been a great pleasure and an honor to deliver the Marshall Legacy Lecture. Thank you.